This is Lynn Fraser with the Kiloby Center for Recovery. I'm really pleased to be here today with Dr. Adi Jaffe. He's written a really interesting book called The Abstinence Myth. And maybe we could actually start there. What's the difference? Part of the reason why I really wanted to talk with you is because you have a different approach
Yeah,
to addiction recovery. So why don't you start there and talk about that a bit?
sure. I'd be happy to. So the Abstinence Myth book came out of the treatment and the work that I do with people. And one of the elements of that has attracted people to my work, I'd say over the last 10 years or so, is that I don't require people to abstain when they work with me. And that really throws people off most of the time. It comes out of my own research. So I got my PhD at UCLA, and when I did my postdoc research, one of the things that bothered me, I focused almost all my studies on addiction, and the way I was initially pretending that I was going to go forward in my career was I really wanted to understand the pathway to addiction. How do people get addicted? Why do they get addicted? Because I've had my own history, and I wanted to understand it. And I thought through that, I would be able to uncover new ways of helping people recover. And then I ran across a statistic that just left me flabbergasted and became really the next 10, 12 years of my career came out of that single um, notion. And it was that 90% of people that struggle with addiction never get help.
Wow.
And yeah, I pretty much had the same reaction because so much came up for me in that moment. First of all, it almost doesn't matter how good our treatment is if 90% of people don't use it.
Right.
Right? We could have 100% effective treatment. And if only 10% of people use it, that means we're only helping 10% of people. And let's be real about it, our treatment approaches are not 100% effective. So that
Mm.
means we're helping a tiny minority. Actually, technically, about 1 out of 100 people who struggle get help through treatment, which is
Right.
insane. And so I wanted to understand why. And I dove pretty deeply into the research. There wasn't a ton of it, but essentially research on barriers to treatment entry. Why do people not enter treatment? There was stuff in the 80s and 90s. This is in 2010 when I'm looking. And I decided, let's do it again. I was really big on trying to use technology. And so I created a study that followed people who were interested in treatment online over 6 months. So we did 4 different assessments with them. And the 4 big barriers that we found were cost and logistics. I think when I say that, that makes sense to everybody. Treatment can be really expensive,
Mhm.
um, and prohibitively so. That was, by the way, something that in the 80s and 90s didn't come up because insurance covered much, much more of treatment in the 80s and 90s. So cost was a new barrier. Logistics, we look down at people who decide not to engage in treatment. But if you think about the logistical nightmare of engaging in treatment, who can leave their life behind for 30, 60, 90 days and then go live in sober living and have 10 to 15 hours of intensive outpatient treatment? I mean, what we ask of people is to completely disrupt their life. Logistically, it's a nightmare. So cost and logistics were 2 of the biggest ones. The third one is not new to people now, but 10 years ago when I was talking about it, nobody was really talking much about it, and that's shame. That was a
Right.
huge barrier. It
Yeah.
was bigger in the beginning, and when we followed people over 6 months, it decreased gradually as they kind of became more used to being part of the conversation. And the fourth barrier, and I do a lot of work on fighting shame, by the way. The
Mhm.
fourth barrier was this really interesting answer to a question that said, what are the barriers? And over 50% of people said, I enjoy drinking and using too much to quit. And when I would say that to people at academic conferences, what they would come back with all the time is essentially telling me, well, those people aren't serious about getting help. And I said, how can you say that? They're literally in the study because they were looking for help. What they're
Mhm.
telling us is, I want help, but I'm not ready to quit, is the way I saw it. And it was amazing to me when I looked into that and realized there are essentially no options for people who want help with their addiction, but are not ready to quit. None. I mean, 10, 12 years ago, there were essentially literally zero. Now there might be 2 handfuls worth.
Right.
Um, and what I realize is it rests really heavily on our entire understanding of addiction. And the understanding of addiction is one is too many, 1,000 is not enough. Once an addict, always an addict. That addicts and alcoholics have this mysterious condition that we haven't really identified yet. It's this disease that is biological, but it's also spiritual, and it's also caused by trauma. Like, we've created this really interesting understanding of addiction, and we've put this guard at the front of getting help for addiction, and that is abstinence.
Right.
And the
Hmm.
idea is, if you really understand that you have an addiction and you're really serious about getting help, you will quit. And I think the evidence is in. We've been doing this for about 90 years now. Most people don't do it. Most
Right.
people don't go get the help. And then most people who go get the help, they don't manage being abstinent forever.
Right.
They slip up, they leave, they come back. And so I wrote The Abstinence Myth to essentially blow out of the water this notion that, first of all, abstinence is the way we should measure recovery. Right now, if you ask somebody, "Oh, you're sober," the response is, "Yeah, I've been sober 5,722 days. My
Right.
sobriety date is blah, blah, blah." We mark how well your recovery is going by how many days in a row you have abstinent. I think it's a terrible single measure.
Right.
It's okay if it's one of the things you want to use to assess it, but it is not a great measure of how well your recovery is going. So that's the number one thing, is that it's not an amazing measure. And then the other piece is that it should stop being a requirement for help. I
Right.
think there should be one requirement for help. You want help.
You want
That
help.
should be it.
Right.
That should be the only requirement. When somebody, I joke about this, but it's not really a joke because we're losing over 100,000 people a year to this. So we should
Yeah.
stop joking about it, really. But I should make help getting so easy that you can stumble into help, right? Like, you should be able to just fall into my office by mistake because I made it that easy to find me, to engage, and to keep coming back. And so that's the way I look at it. The book details things in much more, in much more of a nuanced way. But what I tell people is, look, stop measuring how well you're doing by your abstinence. Start measuring it by how well your life is going. If you're not ready to quit, that's fine, but you better be ready to do some work, because if you want your life to change, there's going to be some work to be done.
Right.
And my entire way of looking at it is, let's understand why you're struggling with the addiction, whatever it is: drugs, alcohol, porn, food, sex, gambling, whatever it is. Let's understand why it's happening, start addressing those issues. And what I've noticed time and time again is, if I help you address those issues, the addiction slowly disappears over time anyway.
Right. I think I'll connect you with Scott Kiloby. The Kiloby Center now doesn't use abstinence as a measure, and especially the shaming after someone's had a slip is so harmful in
Yes.
recovery. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a nuanced thing, because I don't think people in traditional recovery, and by that I mean 12-step based kind of recovery, I don't think they know the damage they do with those. Well, get up and get a new newcomer chip.
Right.
I don't think they understand it. They think of it as, well, people need humility, or it's just a way to tell everybody that you're kind of back at ground zero and you need help. There aren't a lot of other areas in life where we publicly make somebody get up and say, "I screwed up. Um, Pay attention." And I would argue that in any other area where we do it, it probably also shames the people.
Right.
um, like in the business world, for instance, right? In the business world, if your business doesn't do well, it has a bad month, or it fails completely, to start a new business, we don't make you wear a sign around your neck that says, "Hey, my last business failed, but I'm starting from scratch." It's just like, we wouldn't do that in any other areas. By the way, in mental health, and I use this example in the book, it would be unthinkable for a therapist to say to a patient who came in for depression, let's say, "Hey, look, I thought you wanted to stop this depression. We've been working together for 30 days and you haven't been able to be abstinent from your depression. I can't work with you anymore.
Right.
Um, I can only work with people who are not in depression to work on their depression." It sounds ridiculous if I say it in any other area of medicine, mental health care, or really, honestly, any human interaction.
Right.
Um, and yet in addiction, we take it for granted. So the abstinence myth is about saying, look, it's over, it's done, it didn't work, it's never going to work, throw it out. There are a lot of other good things that we do, but this has to leave, because if it doesn't leave, We're going to stay in this place where nobody wants to get help. And even when they get help, they keep feeling like they're failing. I've had clients who went from literally 2 bottles, 2.5 bottles of wine a night to drinking a handful of times a week.
Hmm.
And their families and the people that I tell about them as success go, well, when are they going to be abstinent? And I go, I don't know, but they went from drinking 2 bottles a night to
Right.
drinking like 4 glasses a week. How are you not celebrating this right now?
Yeah.
And they go, well, but they're alcoholics. They're not allowed to drink. And I go, the way you look at the world and the way I look at the world are just completely different.
Right. Right. So let's go to your personal story with addiction and in recovery in particular. And how did that, how did you recover? How did you come out of that? Did you use 12 steps? What
Sure.
did that look like for you?
Yeah. So I'll give you the quick synopsis. Upper middle class family. My dad was a physician. My mom was a human resource manager in a bank. Really nice childhood. I grew up in Israel, moved to the States when I was 14, which is not a great time to move because I moved right into freshman year of high school.
Hmm.
Um, so I'm a foreigner. I'm speaking the language, but with a weird accent. I talk like this, and I'm not very good with the words. And so I'm kind of relegated to the second class person, and I don't know anybody,
Right. Right.
and it was awkward and weird. I didn't really know that at the time. It was a tough situation to be in, but pretty good childhood. I was rebelling a little bit like a teenager, and I discovered alcohol in a sleepaway camp with other Israeli kids. So I was already a little more comfortable than I would have been in my regular surroundings. But I was socially anxious, always was, kind of still is to some extent. I can do these things really, really well, but with foreign people that I don't really know, I struggle feeling super comfortable. And so the boys and the girls went into the same cabin at night. We weren't supposed to, but 14-year-old kids, it's kind of all you do is things you're not supposed to. And as we're hanging out and I'm awkward and nervous around the girls, somebody pulls out a handle of vodka that they brought with them and they pass it around. Now, I think I might have tasted alcohol at some point before because I'm Jewish and there were ceremonies and I probably
Oh,
tasted it, but I never drank. And I knew I wasn't really supposed to. But they passed it around, they handed it to me. And I'm awkward, I'm shy, I feel out of sorts. I'm not going to say no, thank you. I'm going to do whatever everybody else is doing. So I took the thing and I drank it and it burned. Like,
yeah.
oh, just
Yeah.
warm,
It's
straight
awful.
vodka. It's disgusting. But I wasn't going to retch and I was going to throw up in front of all these kids. So I took another couple of swigs and it passed around and it passed around again. And, 20, 30 minutes later, I felt nice.
Hmm.
I wasn't really anxious.
Hmm.
I felt like that wave of constantly paying attention and looking around and trying to figure out what is everybody thinking of me and how can I adjust what I'm doing so that they'll think of me more and better. The volume got turned down on that, and I could hang out with the girls and sort of make moves and not really feel weird about it. And I really liked it. And so for the rest of that weekend, I drank a few more times with them.
Hmm.
And by the time the buses took us back to Newark Airport to go back to Chicago, which is where I was living at the time, I was on cloud nine. And so from that weekend on, when we lived in Chicago, I went to parties with the same kids and their friends now, because now I was drinker a D, and we'd hang out and we'd drink, and it was my medicine. In those places, I wasn't uncomfortable, I wasn't anxious, and it worked
Right.
really well.
It worked. Yeah.
It worked really well. I like kissed a couple of girls. We fooled around. Like again, as an awkward 14-year-old, that was like my measure of success. Can I
Hmm.
get close to girls without running the other way? Um, so it worked, and it really didn't cause much problem. Again, as a 14-year-old impulsive kid who would do anything, I did a lot of really stupid stuff, even that early on. Um, I would kind of try anything somebody gave me. Now, fortunately for me, they didn't give me a whole bunch of different things, but like somebody handed me a nitrous oxide. I just remember this the other day. Somebody gave me a nitrous oxide balloon while I was in the car driving, stopped at a red light. Now, for anybody who's listening to this and doesn't know what nitrous oxide is, it's like laughing gas from your dentist. Well, when you do it, it makes you completely unaware of your surroundings for about 30, 45 seconds. I took this at the wheel of the car, sitting in a
You
red
were
light.
driving.
When I came to, all the other cars were gone. The right light was green and everybody else around me was gone. I was just sitting dead still at a green light. So I also did a lot of really stupid things in the sense of I will just try whatever you hand me. So not the best decisions. But the long story short of it is that same pattern repeated. We moved again to another high school. That's where weed came into the equation in a very similar sort of surroundings. And I kept escalating my drug use. After a really bad breakup, my first like really serious breakup, I tried everything. I tried coke, I tried hallucinogens, I tried ecstasy, I tried anything I could get my hands on. A couple of years later, I got into meth. Um, by that point, I was using enough drugs where I needed to actually kind of sell drugs to my friends to be able to afford my drug use. My drug dealing career took off and I started selling drugs full time. I became pretty heavily addicted to meth for about 3 to 4 years, where I was using all day, every day. And it all came crashing down with a SWAT team arrest. The SWAT team came and somebody told them about my drug use at some point and my drug dealing. And so they came to my apartment at 8 o'clock, beautiful Saturday here in Los Angeles. And that started me
You
on
know, Adi, I'm going to, we're freezing here.
Oh, sorry.
Just sign in by phone as well. Just a second here. I'm having trouble with the line. It seems to be freezing, so I'm going to sign on with my phone as well.
Okay.
And then that way we'll get good audio.
Sure.
Welcome to
And I just quit my browser, so hopefully that'll help a little bit as well. I can't hear you right now. Oh, because this one is. I think you just need to unmute your phone from the. No, but I think. Oh, I think the phone looks like it's actually muted on Zoom. So if on Zoom you go and unmute the phone. Bam.
Okay.
That should be better. You can hear me okay now?
I can, yes.
Okay. Cool.
Okay.
Yeah, and I quit. Like I said, I quit my my browser, and hopefully that'll give us a little better bandwidth on my end too.
Oh,
It looks
okay.
like it's fine, but just in case.
Good. Okay.
So I was addicted to meth. I used it over a period of about 5 years, but the last 3 to 4 years I was using all day, every day. I was selling a lot of it. I was selling a lot of ecstasy and using that every day. I was selling a lot of cocaine and using a little bit of that as well. I was, I put some thought into this a little while ago because I tell this story a lot, but in order for it not to just become a story I tell, I constantly try to kind of uncover new elements of it. And I remember, I would have to say that somewhere between the age of 21, 21 and a half, when my drug dealing and my drug use really started escalating big time. It was already big before then, but really just hit a new level. Until that SWAT team arrest, I don't know that I was sober for one day. And meth was there the whole time. And then there were just other drugs that just kept being added to the mix and being taken out and added to the mix. But I did acid every Friday. I would do ecstasy multiple times a week. I would do cocaine multiple times a week. Like, it was just nitrous oxide in between. I mean, GHB, ketamine. I was like the kitchen sink kind of user with meth always there in the background. And I mean, even, that SWAT team arrest came after a motorcycle accident. I was hospitalized for a couple of weeks because I broke my tibia and my fibula, my shin bones. I had one of my people who was selling drugs for me bring me meth into the hospital so I could smoke meth in my hospital bed. That's where I was. And when I got arrested with the SWAT team, my lawyer said, "You got to go to rehab." And he said, if you don't go to rehab and the judge sees you the way you are right now, you're going to go spend 10, 20 years in prison. So if you don't go to rehab, it's a real uphill battle. I said, let's go to rehab. Let's do it. And the reason really initially was just to avoid prison. I went to a very traditional rehab in Pasadena. I won't name them, but a really traditional rehab. AA meeting circles in the morning, AA meetings in the evening, a whole bunch of groups in between talking about the AA principles in the treatment center itself. And I was there for a full month, initially doing relatively well. And then they let me go back to work. And I put that in air quotes because my work was my recording studio. And all I did out of that recording studio was make music, watch porn, and use drugs. And so when I went back, I relapsed like that. And so I used for 2 months while being in that rehab. Then they found out. I got kicked out and used again for another 2 to 3 weeks while kind of on the streets. I lived out of my car and some friends couch surfing that I did. And then I found my sober living that I ended up getting sober in. Again, a very traditional one. I had no idea that there were even non-traditional approaches. Just nobody pointed me in any direction to anything, not smart recovery, nothing. So I was in that next sober living for 8 months. The entire time, I say fighting my case, but kind of having monthly court dates or bi-monthly court dates. And my dad would fly in from New York to come be in court with me, which was amazing. And my mom would come every once in a while. And 8 months later, so now I'm 8 months sober, the end of the court date kind of was coming to a close, and it was time to figure out what I was actually going to get. And thank God I got sober along the way, because the judge gave me 1 year, which was below the minimums, like below the state minimums. I was supposed to get a minimum of 3 years, even for if you would have taken any one. So I had 13 felony counts that they got me on. You get one for every drug, and there was also like meth manufacturing and ecstasy manufacturing supplies in my house. So they got me on 13 different counts. Pretty much any one of those should have landed me in prison for 3 years minimum. And because I'd cleaned up and my parents were there and they saw the support and they saw that I'd put in the work, the judge gave me 1 year with what's called a 7-year suspended sentence. He said, if you screw this up though, you're going to get 7 years added to whatever next you have. And that was great for me. It really helped me stay in line. But
a big motivator. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really big motivator. So I spent a year in jail after that. Overall, a total of about 2.5, 3 years of sobriety and recovery and traditional approaches. I didn't go to meetings in jail, but I was sober. And, then I tried to get my life back together, which is not that easy for a 9-time convicted felon.
Right.
Really anywhere. But yeah, my initial recovery was all traditional.
And so when you started getting your life back together, your parents were really supportive of what you were doing?
They were. I mean, thank God for my parents. I was talking to one of my clients about this here yesterday. If it wasn't for my parents paying my rent and really helping me pay for food for the first year almost after jail, I didn't have another way of making money. I would have essentially had to either go move in with them, which would have been a nightmare, and there's no way I would have done that probably at the time, or I would have gone back to selling drugs. I couldn't get a job at the mall. I couldn't get hired anywhere. I almost got a job at a pizzeria because the manager there knew the people for my sober living, but then he moved to a different job, and so the job fell through. I mean, I literally could not get hired. And it's something you hear about all the time. I recognize, even as I say it, the privilege of being a white guy who's going through this with parents who could support him is huge. And I was incredibly fortunate to have that. And so my parents supported me, couldn't get hired. I went back to school because it was the only thing I could do. And it was in my first year, second semester of school, that my advisor in my graduate program offered me a position in their research lab. And that was the first paid job that I got. And it was actually also in that job that I realized my passion, which was studying addiction. I wasn't going back to school to study addiction. I was going back to psychology because that was my field before. But I had no idea I was going to spend the rest of my life focusing on addiction. but that guy worked on HIV and hepatitis C with a lot of homeless drug addicts, and the moment I started working with that population, it just made sense, and I've never stopped. And that was 2003 when that started. So
Almost 20 years.
yeah,
Hmm.
so it's been literally 16, 17 years of doing that
Yeah.
work, and I love it. It was also in that graduate program, to segue into my recovery, that I started thinking to myself, I don't think the stuff they were telling me in meetings is true. Um, I
Like
don't know.
what kind of thing?
I don't know if I'm that kind of addict alcoholic that they were talking about or not. I don't think I am. I don't know if there are other people that are that, but I don't think I'm one of these people they talk about. And I went through a period of like 6 to 9 months of real self-questioning and talking to my parents and even my sponsor at AA at the time, saying, I think I'm gonna leave. And you know, for some people listening right now, you might know this already, but there's a lot of indoctrination in in that traditional kind of way, right? Every time you get up and stand up, my name is Adi and I'm an alcoholic. Um, you take on this identity of being a drug addict and alcoholic, which I think is incredibly damaging, especially
Hmm.
early on. And I said, I don't think that's who I am at my core. And I kept talking to my parents, kept talking to my sponsor, kept studying all these different things in psychology, and eventually I took the plunge. I I conducted on myself what is known as the AA experiment, right? That idea of like I'm going to go out and see if I can be normal. The
Hmm.
difference was it wasn't on a whim. I talked to my parents and my sponsor about it for 6 to 9 months. Um, I wasn't doing it because things weren't good. Things were actually pretty good. I was doing it because the way I was living didn't make sense to me, and I'm a pretty inquisitive, self-assessing sort of guy, and I just couldn't fathom living the rest of my life not knowing the answer to this question. And so I remember for sure the conversation I had with my parents before I ever took a drink again. Because by the way, I'm not sober anymore.
Hmm.
I drink socially. I've even tried to smoke weed a handful of times. I just get really paranoid, so I don't like it. Um,
Hmm.
but before I drank again, I said to my parents, "Look, I'm going to do this. We've talked about it. My mom felt pretty okay about it. My dad was scared."
Hmm.
And I said, we know what I'm like when I'm not well functioning, when I'm in that place that they talk about, right? I become, hopefully I can swear on here, I become an
Yeah.
asshole.
Yeah.
Um, I don't return calls. I get short with you guys. I'm not nice. Um, I disappear. If any of those signs show back up, you know I'm screwing up. Don't wait to find out that I'm using drugs. You don't have to. You know what I behave like when I'm in that place. I'll be hiding things if I need to hide them from you guys. But
Right.
you'll know because I'll be the guy. Right now, I'm answering all your phone calls. I talk to you. We have a great relationship. If that goes south, you know something is up. And I'm happy to report that, that was in 2005 now. So, 14 years going and it's going great. Um,
Hmm.
and so I started learning a lot and teaching myself a lot and exploring a lot about what is recovery? How do we measure it? How do I know if my recovery is going well? Um, what techniques work and which don't? How can I support people in finding a route to recovery that works for them? And that's really, when I talk about the Abstinence Myth book, I talk here at the bottom of this kind of ignited recovery method. This has been something that's been in the works for me for 5 to 7 years. It's been live now for 2, but I ran a treatment center for 5 years before that was non-abstinence only based. And
Hmm.
my goal is to take that phrase that we hear a lot, which is meeting a client where they're at, and make it as true to form as we possibly can do it. And I'm really proud of the work. As I mentioned, my recovery is going great. It's an ongoing process of growth. I don't think it ever stops.
Right.
But it's going really, really well. Not sober, haven't been sober. I take a break. I take like dry January every year, and I do things like that as part of abstinence in my life. But um, I have a system that works really, really well, and I've gone from like a kitchen sink, living in his car, kicked out of rehab, drug addict, right? That person they always describe as a quintessential person, um, to living what any person who knows me in the world would just consider a normal life.
Hmm. Hmm. So, what's your sense of maybe this is too big of a question, but so when you were in high school and then in college and you were drinking socially and then you were doing drugs and things were getting, I mean, to do that much meth every day and all those other drugs, that's pretty intense.
Yeah.
Were you trying to like what's the relationship with trauma there? I guess trauma
Mm.
is such a driver of addiction, trying to get away from pain and isolation. And do you feel like that was what was going on for you, or was it more just a slide into the
Yeah.
drugs, or what was going
So
on?
look, there were definitely experiences. I mean, like I said, a lot of my drug use would escalate after breakups. And if you think about it,
Okay.
social anxiety and weirdness, especially feeling like I'm not good enough in relationships. And so when I would get out of a relationship, when somebody would break up with me, there would be a lot of internal anxiety and fear about I'm never going to find anybody. I'm always going to be a loser. Like that internal language would always be happening.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's not big T trauma. We all go through that kind of stuff, but it's little T trauma. It's this
Hmm.
abandonment within relationships. So that happened certainly and definitely exacerbated my drug use. But also, I had another little T trauma. My dad left us for literally like 3 days. He had cheated on my mom and left the family for 3 days, and then he came back. Um, but the trauma of dealing with the fact that my dad left us made me hate him for
Mm.
15 years after that moment. Um, and so that definitely had an impact. I talk about in the book 4 factors: biology, psychology, environment, and spirituality. And I think all of us have a mix. All of us who struggle with these issues have a mix, probably with all mental health issues, have a mix of those 4 things.
Hmm.
So my trauma wasn't massive. I wasn't beaten as a child. Nobody sexually molested me. Um, I had a big move, right? That's also trauma to have
Oh
that big
yeah.
move.
Hmm.
So I had traumas. We all have at least little t traumas. Nobody gets through life unscathed. So I definitely had some of
Right.
that. I also have some biological predisposition. My brain is pretty scattered and impulsive just by nature. And so growing up, like I said, I would just do things because they were in front of me versus other people who are really risk averse and would say, no, I don't really
Right.
want to try anything new. So I'm definitely more on the impulsive. So the biology plays a role in there a little bit as well. Um, Environmental pressure, right? I was hanging out with these kids who were drinking. That's part of it. And for me, for a
Hmm.
long time, honestly, probably until my 30s, long after this initial recovery period, the spiritual component of finding something bigger than myself. I don't believe in God. I don't even know that I believe in a higher power per se. My purpose in life and my service of other people has become my thing that's bigger than me. I help people every day. I help families every day because of my online programs and the books. We've helped thousands and thousands of people at this point. The people I've helped are a force bigger than I am. And so that becomes a motivating factor for me. But I was absolutely unaware of anything like that, if you go back 10, 15 years in my life. And so that's how I identify the 4 factors in my life. But in my work, I help people figure out, well, where are you on these 4 factors? Is biology a really big thing for you? Then maybe medication and some of those elements can be a really useful part of the equation for you. Or maybe you need to figure out biological ways of reducing stress and anxiety and things of that nature in your brain. If psychology, big T trauma is part of your issue, then doing trauma work, somatic work, EMDR, like doing really deep work, introducing mindfulness and meditation can be useful. Like, I don't even think I say this in a lot of my talks. I don't even think addiction is one thing. Um,
Right.
I think it's just a catch-all phrase we've given people who struggle with drugs, alcohol, sex, gambling, food issues. We throw them in this basket because they struggle with similar things, but the underlying issues can be very, very different. I don't think addiction is its own thing.
Well, and what you were talking about as a teenager too, that the power of inclusion and of feeling calmer and less anxious.
Yeah,
Um, I would do anything. Somebody handed me a needle one time. I'm like, okay.
yeah.
And luckily for me, that was before HIV and AIDS.
Mm,
But I didn't have something that said, no, that's not safe. Don't do that.
Sure.
you know. So it's
Yeah,
hard
but
to be a teenager and to have all of that going on, and then all of the drugs that are available. And I mean, it's not just now; it was back then too. You know, I'm in my mid
it's
fifties, so
always been there. Look, I
that was a
mean,
while.
the overall addiction problem is as big now as it's ever been. Um, I don't know that the addiction problem is worse. The drugs keep changing, and the specifics of what we're dealing with keeps changing. Fentanyl has killed more people, um, but alcohol is still the biggest killer of people who struggle with addiction. So even though
Mm-hmm.
opiates have really ramped up, and it's an incredibly sad thing, and we need to do everything we can to help with it,
Mm-hmm.
alcohol has been killing more people than are currently being killed by overdose from opiates. And by the way, a lot of times the reason people die from opiates is a mixing of drugs. So, um,
Right.
so even if there's fentanyl, it's the mix of benzos and alcohol and opiates or things of that nature that kill people. So
Mm-hmm.
we haven't we haven't found a way to reduce people's desire to change the way they feel. Um, and that's a much
Mm-hmm.
bigger societal thing, right? Like when I give talks to people on how do you determine your happiness, um, how do you measure success in your life in general, not in recovery at all, just in life. That's when we get into the deeper core issues of, hey, we all just want to feel like we belong, and if we don't feel like we belong and like people like us, we're gonna do pretty much anything to feel like we belong and make people like us. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that's a big social question, and it is something that a lot of people in recovery have to struggle with, because if you're going to not end up in a situation where you rely on drugs and alcohol to make you feel okay, you do have to figure out other ways to feel okay. You can't go through, this is my thing about why abstinence is such a terrible measure of recovery. We all know people who've been abstinent for 30 years and are freaking miserable.
Right.
I don't consider that recovery. Is it better than laying on the ground and like pissing on yourself and having no communication with anybody? Sure. But
Yeah.
abstinence is a pretty low measure of recovery in my assessment. I
Mm-hmm.
know my whole point is I know people who every once in a while drink, even if they want to abstain, and they slip up here and there, or they drink more than they want to, but are taking care of other areas of life, and they're doing substantially better in their overall recovery in life than some people who are completely abstinent and are absolutely miserable. So I
Yeah.
want people to introduce more nuance and start thinking to myself, well, what are the four factors that are affecting me? Why am I even doing this thing? And then when you go handle those, you see yourself open up in life in general. Life gets better. And so you don't feel like you need to rely on these other substances as much. And then there's, habit work, and some of the things that we do are habitual. And so we have to change our habits, which is not that easy.
Right. So tell us about Ignited. What
Sure.
would people find there?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I did this research. I keep going back to the number four, but the four big uh, prohibitors of people getting into help was shame, cost, logistics, and abstinence. And I ran this rehab for 5 years, and we took care of the abstinence thing, and we tried to take care of the shame piece, but it was still expensive and logistically a nightmare, right? Intensive outpatient treatment is 10 to 12 hours a week. Partial hospitalization treatment is, like 20, 30 hours a week. It's like a full-time job. When I left that treatment center, when it closed, I thought to myself, how do I create something that addresses all four barriers? How do I keep costs low, make the logistics simple, reduce people's shame, and not require abstinence? What would that even look like? And the only answer I could find was online help. And so I created this online program. The first time it ran only had 8 people in it. Um, it's cheap. It's $3 a day, $97 a month. Um, it's logistically really easy to get to because you can do it from your phone or your laptop. More than half of our people literally do their sessions before work, after work, or during their lunch break. They just put headphones on, they go outside, they eat their lunch, and they watch their work. We also have online meetings that happen at different times, so you can get additional help on top of the kind of regimented coursework. the shame is almost non-existent because you literally don't have to talk to anybody. So you can sign up to our program. We've had about 240 people enroll in the last 2 years. 80-90% of those people I've never met, I've never talked to. If I go through, I can see their email and what they've done in the program, but I don't know who they are. And so I don't exacerbate people's shame by making them have to walk into a room and talk to somebody live. Now, again, I think live support and group support is incredibly useful. So we have those things built in, but we'll have online groups where we do things exactly like you and I are doing right now, but there will be 10, 20, 30 people in the group. Some of them have their video cameras off. Some of them have it on. We don't mandate you to show your face if you don't feel like it. So we reduce shame in that way. And as I mentioned before, you given the book, obviously, and things like that, we don't mandate abstinence. We say to people, look, we'll help you figure out what you're ready to work on. We'll help you work on that. And what we've seen over time, it's not 100% successful. Nothing in the world is 100% successful. What we've seen over time is the majority of people end up at least reducing their use. And what I love about it is roughly 40 to 50% of the people who come to us to only reduce their use actually end up deciding to abstain completely because they like it better. So even without mandating abstinence, almost 50% of our people end up choosing abstinence, which is a really, really beautiful side effect. And so, as I mentioned, it's been running for 2 years, literally since late October, early November 2017. We've helped hundreds of people. The book has sold thousands of copies in itself. And my goal is to help 1 million people beat their addiction in whatever way works for them. And the easier I can make it to get the help, the cheaper, the less complicated, the less shaming, the better off we are. I can't hear you. Nope.
It's quite noisy. I'm in the library here,
Got it.
and there's a teen group that are right outside the little office that I'm in. So I have myself on mute. So thanks for telling me that. So could you give an example or two of some of the people that you've worked with, either in Ignited or in the other program?
Oh, absolutely. I love these stories more than anything else. There's so many. I'll give a couple. Is that okay? So I'll give you the ones first that are publicly, like they've done video testimonials for us because they love what we've done so much, because that way I don't have to alter people's names. So one of the people was Julia, really successful life coach for people, an author, marketing expert, did great work in her life, but was drinking heavily 4 to 5 times a week. And by heavily, I mean, that 2 bottle of wine thing during the week, and it would get even more extreme, 10, 12, 15 drinks a night on the weekend sometimes. She tried everything before she found me, and she actually found me through another client who had tried something called the Sinclair method with me. I don't know if you are familiar with the Sinclair method or not, but it's an naltrexone using method where you don't have to quit. So she came to me for the Sinclair method. And like I said, I don't care why you come in. I'll help you with whatever you want on the front end. And we'll see where it goes. So she didn't want to ever quit. She came to moderate her use. We did all remote work. I've still to this day never met this woman in person. And we started out and I told her, look, we'll do the medication piece. The biology is important, but I'm letting you know right now, when I help you get your alcohol use under control, and I will, other stuff will come up, life stuff that you don't think is there right now, but will show up. And she was like, yeah, whatever. I've seen a psychologist a lot. I don't need that. I just need the help with the alcohol. I said, no problem. Within 2 sessions and a little bit of titrating help, we had her down where she was literally only drinking 2 days a week and was drinking 2 to 3 drinks on any one of those days. So alcohol wise, she was doing great. And then all the other life stuff started showing up. Anxiety around work, perfectionism, social anxiety when she would hang out with her husband and would go out, fear of never having fun again, all these things. And so we started working through those, and still all remote, and it was going well, and it was really, really beautiful. Still drinking 2 to 3 drinks a week. And then one day she calls me panicked, and she says, it's all going to fall apart. And I go, why? What's going on? And, we get this a lot, right, in this field is there's a lot of black or white thinking. And so she was going to visit a friend. And in this visit, every time in the past, she used to drink a lot. The two of them would sit around this wealthy woman. She would go hang out in her big home and they would just drink wine all day. And she's saying to herself, I'm going to go there. And even though things are going really, really well right now, they're going to fall apart. And what I showed her, and this is why I think my name is Julia and I'm an alcoholic version of things is so damaging. I said, look at all the work you've done over the last 2 to 3 months and look at how well things are going. What makes you believe that it's so fragile that a single trip to a friend could break everything you've done? And we realized, and it makes sense, that the only reason is she's never done it any other way with this friend. And so I had these set of exercises around essentially visualization. And we created an entirely different scenario for this trip she was going to go on. And in the scenario, she wasn't abstinent, but she drank 1 or 2 glasses of wine, depending. It was a 3-day trip. So 1 glass of wine when she got there in the evening, and then 2 glasses of wine a day on the other 2 days. We do all this planning over a week and a half. She's really secure. She's really happy about it. And she goes to the friend's house, comes back, and we do a session to download. She goes, it didn't work. I go, okay, tell me what happened. My whole thing is always nothing is a failure. Failure is stopping to try. So what happened? Tell me what happened. So, well, I didn't only drink 1 the first day and 2 on the other 2 days. I said, well, what did it look like? She said, well, I had 2 glasses the first night. And then the second day I had 3. The last day I managed to only have 2, but the second day I had 3. And I go, how much would you normally drink when you're with that friend? She said, well, I'd probably drink like a bottle to myself the first night, and then at least that much, if not more, on each one of the days. I said, okay, I need you to explain to me where else in your life you go from having 10 to 15 drinks a day down to 1 to 3, which is, so 90% reduction in your drinking over the time you were there. And where else would you consider that to be a failure? And she really had to think hard. She said, yeah, there aren't a lot of other places in my life where if I did that well, I would consider it a failure. So what makes you consider it a failure? And she said, and a whole thing came out about, we set goals and I should have hit those goals exactly. Because if I don't hit my goals exactly, then it's a failure, which exposed I talked about underlying issues. Her psychology, she had a huge perfectionism and performance thing that was underlying all of this. And I said, well, look, Julia, we wanted you to have 5 drinks. You had something like 7. I consider that a huge win. I want to congratulate you for being amazing at it. And literally that reformulation that day, that one session, because she already did a lot better than she was when she first came to see me, but that reformulation allowed her to shift the internal negative shame language around her drinking. Now, here's the magic. This is 2 years ago when that happened. On her own, her drinking was going okay. But on her own, Julia decided to abstain. She said, you know what? I'm only really drinking once or twice a week. I don't really like it. It kind of just makes me tired. I'm going to stop. But here's, again, I'm going to show, the book is The Abstinence Myth. Here's Julia's version of current abstinence. It's been 2 years now. This is not new. It's not going to fall apart any moment. Her dad passed away during this process too, and she made it through that as well. Her version of abstinence is this. She doesn't drink. But if she goes to a special event, a wedding, a birthday, and somebody offers her a toast, she'll take a couple of sips. Maybe she'll finish the glass. She probably won't, and she'll put it down. Alcohol is just not an issue for her anymore. It's not something she worries about. She doesn't have to force herself to abstain anymore, and she doesn't have to drink all the time. She doesn't drink, and when it shows up, she's okay with it. And that's one example that I like using because it seems so normal, but it's exactly one of those things that traditional treatment has told us is impossible, right? She was struggling for 15 years with drinking before I ever met her. So that's one version. I have another example that is a lot more extreme because that's a lot of people will say, yeah, but Julia was one of those housewives. She wasn't. She's a business person and really successful, but like she only drank a little bit of wine. That's not that big a deal. I have a client who I've been working with for, I guess, 3 years. Well, I worked with her 3 years ago. We worked together for about a year. And when she came to me, she was after 4 rehab stints. The best, I'm not going to name the rehab, but the best rehabs, like when the best rehabs in the world, the ones that advertise all the time and cost $80,000 a month, those, over a period of 6 years, she went to 4 of those, lived in a bunch of sober livings, would relapse every single time within days after leaving. By the time she got to me, she was diagnosed as bipolar, borderline, and generalized anxiety disorder. And she was addicted to alcohol, marijuana, and nitrous oxide. Her whole family had this notion that if they could just get her to not go to prison and jail for the rest of her life and maybe get her to live in at least sober livings and not rehab, they would be happy. She was so defeated. I mean, so defeated by the time she got to see me. She felt like she would have to smoke weed every day, all day, and drink every day just to be okay. And nitrous oxide, she was going to try to stay away from because it was costing so much money. It was such a hard drug to function with. So that was the way she was thinking about it. She had chronic back pain. She had gained a bunch of weight. It was a nightmare. And like I said, I try to really reduce shame and make no assumptions about where somebody's life can go. And so when we started doing the work, I said, look, we'll work with whatever you have right now. Your back really hurts. You can only sit for 30 minutes. At the end of 30 minutes, go have a cigarette, come back. She would go have a cigarette and not come back for 3 hours because her anxiety would take over, etc. She thought we would kick her out because in the past, if she wasn't adherent to treatment, she'd get kicked out of places. And we just didn't kick her out. We just kept working. Within about 3 to 6 months, we got her to the place where she wasn't smoking weed every day. And she was drinking almost every day, but now it's like a glass or 2 of wine at night. Now, at this point, she's 28 years old. This started when she was 20, 21. The struggle started, right? She couldn't hold a job. She couldn't go back to school. Any conversation about any of those things would just bring up her notion of all her past failures. And she would just start crying. I mean, she would just sit in my office and just bawl for 30 minutes every time the conversation of what are you going to do in the future in your life would come up. So we started really gradually and slowly, right? It wasn't about, I don't believe in you got to break people down to build them up. They're already broken down enough. I don't need to break you down. I need to show you how to reinforce you. There's a concept in psychology called scaffolding. And so we started offering scaffolding. We looked for part-time jobs and we started looking and seeing if she could do one of those. Still not completely sober, by the way, right? Just so we're clear. She lived in a sober living, but they were willing to work with us. So got a part-time job, went to the training for that job, left in the middle of the training. She couldn't handle it because of the anxiety. We had to process that. Huge feelings of failure. Felt like, oh my God, this is a sign. I'll never be able to do it again. I said, let's regroup. What else can we do? And we started looking and looking and looking. 3 to 4 months after this first job inquiry, she got her first part-time job that she could actually maintain 10 hours a week. That's it. Because she was able to hold a job now, her parents were willing to see if she could live in her own place with roommates. She moved in with a roommate who smoked weed all day, every day. Her marijuana use started being exacerbated. Why? 4 factors, right? Biology, psychology, environment, and spirituality. The environmental influence was big. We had to work through that. I worked with this woman for 1.5 years. When she left us, she still wasn't 100% sober. She was smoking weed, but not daily anymore. That roommate had left. And she was drinking sporadically, a few times a week. This was in 2016 or 2015 was when I stopped seeing her. About 1 year after I was done seeing her, because she had the tools and she kept working through her own issues at that point. She sends me an email and asks if I would be willing to write her a letter of recommendation. And I said, for what? She said, I'm going to apply to grad school. Now, this is a woman who the mere mention of graduate school before would make her fall apart because she failed out of graduate school 2 times and couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't think about it. I said, absolutely, of course I'll write you a letter. One of the letters was to NYU, was to a university on the other side of the country. This is a woman who couldn't live outside of a sober living, a rehab, or her parents' house without falling apart. And she was applying to school on the other side of the country. I gave her the letter. She got into NYU. She went back to school. And every 6 months or so, I check in with her just to see how she's doing. In the middle of applying to school, she stopped smoking weed on her own because it wasn't serving her in school. She still drinks sporadically socially. She's good. A year ago, she contacted me. She finished graduate school and was looking for work now. And I just saw her literally 3 months. I hadn't seen her in years, but 3 months ago, she was struggling with work-related issues. She said, "Can I come in to just do one session?" She'd lost weight. She has no chronic back pain. She's not on medication for any of the mental health disorders that she was struggling with originally. And she's now normal. I have seen hundreds of cases like these two. Both people who seem totally functional and were just really struggling with drugs or alcohol, and that's all they needed to fix, and people whose lives looked like a complete disaster. And I have to tell people, when we shift, and I talk a lot about internal beliefs and your perspective in the world. I think that's a huge part of the equation that we're talking about here. I've seen transformations that are miraculous that I wouldn't have even fathomed to imagine or hope for in the past. And the thing that comes out of it, it comes down to a piece of the puzzle, which is why I have this F shame bracelet on my wrist. And it gets back to the shame component. And the biggest difference between the Ignited Recovery work and the rest of the work that I see being done out there is empowerment. I don't believe anybody I work with is powerless over anything.
Right.
We're not all powerful. We're not superhuman either. But we are not powerless. And when you allow people to sink in at the deepest level to their power, to where they can exert influence, to where they have control over their life, you see people flourish in ways that you could have never imagined it. And the list of examples goes on and on and on. I could tell stories for weeks. But the reason I like those two is they go from an older woman who was only struggling with alcohol to a younger woman whose life seemed like a complete and utter failure. And both have ended up in a place where if you ask them right now, addiction is not part of their lexicon anymore. They don't struggle with it. They don't have to think about it. And it's all possible. It's possible, in my opinion, for the vast majority of people who struggle right now.
Right. Wow. So if someone here is new to recovery, or maybe they've been in these kinds of recovery circles for a while, but shame in particular, is an issue, and that kind of hopelessness of, well, yeah, maybe other people can get better, but I can't. And what would you say to them?
I would say a couple of things. First of all, if you watch and you pay attention to the stories of success that we all follow in life, I use the classic examples, the J.K. Rowling and the Thomas Edison with the 10,000 experiments for a light bulb, and the Michael Jordans with 300 missed shots and 26 games that he lost for his team by taking the wrong shot at the wrong time. To Abraham Lincoln, like, just you can pick examples left and right. They are all marked by long stretches and common occurrences of what we call failure. The difference between successful people and unsuccessful people is, what do you do when things don't work out the way you want them to? Do you start believing there's something inherently wrong with you that makes you unable to succeed? That's shame. Or do you say to yourself, as Thomas Edison said, I just learned one more way not to do the thing I'm trying to do. Let me figure out what will work. It worked for me, right? I recovered in a setting that worked. I was sober. I just wasn't happy. So I had to find something else. Like I talked to you about the two examples that I just gave. This one woman, she failed 4 rehabs, 4 of the best rehabs. Her parents spent over $1 million before they ever came to see me on rehab. She wrote to me in her last letter. She said, before I saw you, I thought I was damaged beyond repair, because of the 4 best treatment centers. These treatment centers falsely advertise 80, 90% success rates. It's insane. I don't know how they get away with it, but they do. She said, the best 4 rehabs in the world couldn't fix me. And I thought to myself, if they can't fix me, what's wrong with me? And so my answer to people who are struggling right now, there's nothing wrong with you that nobody can fix. It doesn't exist. The only thing you need to think to yourself is this: what help is out there that matches the problems I'm struggling with? It is my job to go find that help and marry it with myself and go all in on the thing that works for me. Forget what other people tell you you have to do. Use them for suggestions, but do not believe somebody else that tells you because this works for me, it'll work for you. We are all different. You have your own unique mix of struggles. I don't purport to know what you're struggling with right now. Obviously, I believe if you want to learn about a different way of looking at things, check out the book. Even if you don't engage in any of the other stuff we do, it'll give you a completely different way of thinking about your addiction. You're not broken. Your brain is not damaged beyond repair. There's more than enough hope for you to go around. If something hasn't worked, try something else. You can beat this. That's my biggest message.
So do you work with people around other kinds of addictions as well, or is it mostly alcohol and drugs?
No, actually, I mean, the Ignite Recovery framework works for everything. So I get, because of my own personal story, so my own story includes alcohol, weed, meth, and sex issues. So those are kind of the big four that people normally come to me just because they relate to my story. But we have people dealing with gambling. We have people dealing with opiates. We have people dealing with whole different set, like a whole slew of different sex related and relationship and intimacy related issues. Like I said, I don't look at any addiction as being part of a big addiction umbrella. Every person has to understand why their own unique struggles exist. And if they go address that core set of issues, it doesn't really matter what they deal with. Not only is that not a problem anymore, but what we get with our clients, which I love, is you get less cross addiction. You get less of this switching, right? Because people will quit alcohol and then go to sugar, or quit alcohol and then go to pills because the underlying issues haven't been solved. So my goal is let's deal with the rotting underlying core issues that have been sitting there for decades and not treated, and then the rest of the problem primarily goes away. Right.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. So how do people get a hold of you? Do you want to just give your website address and that kind of thing?
Sure. If you're interested in the book, theabstinenceMyth.com is the easiest way to get there. I have my own website, adjaffe.com. And we will also give you the Ignited. So Ignited is spelled IGNTD. I thought I was really smart when I did this because I thought everybody would get it. But you see it, it's just IGNTD right there. Yeah. People always look at it and they go, what's IGNTD? And I go, oh, Ignited. But if you go to ignited.com, you can check the website. Okay. And then my wife and I do relationship work with couples because of our own work in the past. So, I think I'm getting easier to find. People tell me I'm still pretty hard to find. So hopefully this will help.
I hope so. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been great talking with you, and very much in alignment with, the compassion and kindness and respect for human beings that really people need when we're in recovery.
Thank you. Yeah. I couldn't agree more, and I'd love to connect more and do more work together.
Yeah, for sure. We'll keep in touch. Thank you.
Hello, this is Lynn Fraser with the Kiloby Center Radical Recovery Summit. We are so excited to bring you the lineup for January 10th to 19th, 2020. Go to radicalrecoverysummit.com to see the new headliners for 2020 and to sign up. You can watch free January 10th to 19th or buy an all-access pass.